what you've heard Trump say is that we don't want to do the Inflation Reduction Act. We don't even want to do the CHIPS Act, right? He denigrated the CHIPS Act in his State of the Union speech the other day.
Yes.
And he seems to think that industrial policy has no place and that he can get investment in key sectors of the U.S. economy just through tariffs. Personally, I just don't see. I don't believe that would happen.
Welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Jeff Bleich, and I'm the former United States Ambassador to Australia and a member of the Commonwealth Club World Affairs Board of Governors. So now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Edward Fishman, author of the, as of today, New York Times best-selling Choke Point, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. This really is the definitive work on economic warfare. And given recent events, I believe we launched and then unlaunched two trade wars. Then we launched another trade war, and then we went back and relaunched the trade wars we had unlaunched, and then we unlaunched them again today. This book should probably be required reading for anyone who's trying to understand what's going on and how these things can possibly play out. Edward is a leading authority on economic statecraft and sanctions. He teaches at Columbia University's School of International and Public Law and Public Affairs, and is a just international and public affairs.
Yeah.
Yep. And a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Previously, Edward served at the U.S. State Department as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, and he served at the Pentagon as an advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and at the U.S. Treasury Department as a special assistant to the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. I have to say, I genuinely enjoyed your book. It's well written. It's accessible, it's thoughtful, and it somehow makes things like blocking sanctions and foreign direct product rule just as interesting as a naval blockade or missile defense. So congratulations on the book, and welcome to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's great to be here. And nice to see so many friendly faces.
So look, economic warfare. It's nearly as old as nation states themselves. But it's gained a lot of popularity, really starting in the period after World War II, and then even more so following the fall of the Soviet Union. But in the last 20 years, it feels as though it has really taken off. And economic sanctions, export controls, and investment restrictions seem to be one of America's favorite tools for resolving conflict without putting lives at risk. So how did we get here? What are the forces that are driving that?
Sure. So thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's really nice to be back in San Francisco and to see so many friendly faces in the audience. So as you say, Jeff, economic warfare is as old as history. If you go back even to the first work of history, Thucydides, during the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, the ancient Athenians imposed a trade embargo on their neighboring city-state of Megara. So a lot of people ask me, why are you calling this the age of economic warfare, this period from 2006 to present? I think the best way to illustrate is to go back to right before the age of economic warfare, the 1990s. And the canonical case of economic sanctions in the 1990s, which I think most people in the room probably remember, was the United Nations embargo against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. This embargo was put in place in 1990, right after Saddam Hussein invaded and annexed Kuwait. And it was kept in place for 13 years, all the way from 1990 to 2003, when George W. Bush ordered another invasion of Iraq. And the way that that embargo was actually implemented, the way that the United Nations prevented Iraq from selling its oil on world markets, was that it had naval forces, U.S. sailors, coupled with naval officers and ships from 20 other countries, patrolling the Persian Gulf 24/7 for 13 straight years. So basically, even in the 1990s, economic warfare was really an offshoot of military warfare. It was the Pentagon who was required to actually make these sanctions work. What happened, though, Jeff, and I think you're right to acknowledge the fall of the Soviet Union as a critical turning point. In the 1990s, when you have Russia and China sort of ushered into the world economy, you have hyperglobalization in which financial markets and supply chains become globalized for the first time ever. And what happens is there's the creation of these choke points in the world economy, like the US dollar-based financial system, like advanced semiconductor supply chains, oil supply chains, where all of a sudden, by the time you get to the 2000s, you can have the director of the Office of Foreign Assets Control at the Treasury Department sign a document in her office in Washington, and just by signing that document, impose economic harm on a foreign country, an order of magnitude more intense than that 1990s naval blockade of Iraq. And so I think, just a short answer to your question, is that economic warfare in the wake of hyperglobalization in the 1990s became both significantly more impactful and much easier to impose, because you did not have to actually send American servicemen into the line of fire.
Yeah. One of the ways that you communicate that trajectory is through personal stories of individuals, and one of the heroes in the book is Stuart Levy, who was, essentially not anonymous to people in D.C., but to the rest of us, sort of an anonymous staffer in the Treasury Department, and he became an architect of some of the critical tools here, and also kind of a pathfinder for future tools. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about him?
Sure. So Stuart Levy is a lawyer, and in 2004, he was serving in the Justice Department, working actually on counterterrorism, basically some of the laws that had been imposed after 9/11. And in 2004, Levy was appointed the first Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the Treasury Department. And at the time, it was sort of an obscure role. It was a new agency within Treasury that had been created. And the first issue that really came to his plate, so just putting ourselves back in 2004, was Iran's nuclear program. It was very clear that the Iranian government was building the capabilities to potentially build a nuclear weapon. They had enrichment programs that were buried deep underground. And we had just gotten over invading Iraq and overthrowing Saddam Hussein to try to get rid of a nuclear program. The challenge was we were already fighting two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there was no political will to fight another one, particularly against a country like Iran that had 80 million people and was a significantly harder target than either Iraq or Afghanistan. And so Levy is put in this role, and basically George W. Bush, after he appoints him, has a press conference where he's asked, well, why aren't you imposing sanctions on Iran? And Bush says, we've already had sanctions on Iran. We can't sanction them anymore. And the idea was basically, he was still thinking in this 90s mindset that in order to have aggressive sanctions on Iran, you needed the UN Security Council to back it, which you'd never get because the Russians, even the Europeans, wouldn't have backed an embargo on Iran. And then you'd actually need to deploy naval ships in the Strait of Hormuz, which was not something they were willing to do. And what Levy, when he hears this, he sort of takes it as a personal challenge. He says, you just appointed me to this job, and now you're saying I don't have any utility. And what he thought, he kind of had this aha moment actually when having breakfast in Bahrain of all places, where he read an article in the Financial Times about how a Swiss bank had decided to stop doing business with Iran. And he thought to himself, wait, banks themselves make risk-based decisions about which countries they want to operate in. And so maybe I don't have to persuade the British or the French or the Russians or the Chinese to go along with sanctions. I can just go meet with executives at banks in London, in Frankfurt, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, bring with me dossiers of declassified intelligence, basically showing how their banks were being used to funnel money to Iran's nuclear program or to Hamas or Hezbollah. And most of these bankers would say, oh my God, I can't believe that my bank is doing this. I want nothing to do with it, because they don't want the reputational damage.
Right.
And then for the stragglers, some banks that say, we're going to take this risk anyway, Levy can tell them, well, if you keep doing this, I'm going to cut you off from the US dollar. And so Levy, just by basically doing this direct-to-business diplomacy, winds up isolating Iran from the international financial system.
And he was able to isolate them in part because of unique features of the United States. I mean, the fact that we are the reserve currency of the world, What are some of the other critical features? You had mentioned the choke points that were relevant for the Iran sanctions.
Yeah, so for the Iran sanctions in particular, it really does come down to the financial system. So what Levy does that's so important is really isolating Iran, so breaking Iran's banking relationships. But by the time Levy leaves Treasury in 2011, there's still one critical financial relationship that Iran has, and that is to other countries who are paying Iran for its oil. You guys may have heard of the petrodollar. Oil is priced in dollars, and actually one of my favorite stories I tell in Choke Points is how that came to be, but we'll save that for hopefully when you read the book. And what basically the US government realizes is you could actually impose an embargo on Iranian oil through using the petrodollar as a choke point. So what they do is, in 2012, really pressured by Congress, because you have these Iran hawks in both the Democratic Party, like Bob Menendez, and in the Republican Party, led by Mark Kirk, who's a senator from Illinois, putting pressure on the Obama administration basically to do as much as they possibly can to drive Iran's economy off a cliff. And so what they come up with is this idea that they can go to banks around the world and say, if you pay Iran for your oil, we'll sanction you. You know, big bank in China, big bank in India. But we will give you an exemption if, as a country, you significantly reduce your oil purchases from Iran over a 6-month period. So basically you gave these big countries like China and India a glide path to say, okay, well, maybe last 6 months I imported 1 million barrels of Iranian oil, next 6 months I'll do 800,000. And after a year and a half, Iran's oil sales go from 2.5 million barrels a day to 1 million barrels a day. So a 60% decline just by weaponizing the petrodollar.
Now, did we try to do the same thing with Russia?
The answer is no. And I think that that is a tragic error that several administrations make. For the Obama administration, I think there's a little bit better of an excuse. I was involved in crafting the original Russia sanctions in 2014. And just for context, at the time in 2014, Russia's economy is larger than all other economies under sanctions combined. Russia is the largest exporter of fossil fuels. And critically, when Russia annexes Crimea, I don't know if you guys remember this, in March of 2014, little green men show up in Crimea. We at the State Department found out about this with everybody else. We show up to work, and basically on CNN, you see the little green men showing up in Crimea. So unlike the Iranian nuclear program, where this is a long, slow-burning crisis, this is a hair on fire, run to the Situation Room, and try to figure out what to do. And so the Obama administration is sort of working from behind events, and they're never really even considering going as far as doing aggressive oil sanctions. Trump, when he comes in 2017, basically does nothing on Russia sanctions. And so, he has no interest in imposing pressure on the Kremlin. So I think by the time Joe Biden comes in 2021, and you have 100,000 Russian troops massing on the Ukrainian border, gearing up for an invasion, by then, I think Putin is determined that the West just doesn't really have the stomach to go after the lifeblood of his economy, which is oil sales. And Biden, who I think is probably the most hawkish American president on Russia since the end of the Cold War, he himself is even hesitant to go after Iran's oil sales because the context in 2021, 2022 is inflation at a 4-decade high, oil prices edging up close to $100 a barrel, and ultimately he was unwilling to take the domestic economic costs that would have been required to do that kind of sanctions program on Russia.
Yeah. Now, how much of it is that they hadn't gamed this out earlier? I mean, one of the things that struck me in your book is that when I think about use of traditional force, kinetic force, there are all sorts of game plans and strategies that are developed, and depending on the situation, they're kind of ready to go. You pull them right off the shelf. Whereas it seemed to me that we were still kind of learning as we go and thinking of economic sanctions and tools as almost an afterthought.
Look, the story I tell in Choke Points is really one of experimentation and discovery. More often than not, we're almost stumbling upon these choke points that we then weaponize as opposed to really thinking it through in advance. You mentioned in your intro, I had the good fortune of also doing a stint at the Pentagon, where I worked for then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marty Dempsey, Army General. And I got to see how the military prepares for things like a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And basically what they do is they come up with options, they vet them, they do tabletop exercises, and then they actually rehearse them. This is what a military exercise is. You literally go through the motions year after year after year to try to pressure test your plan. We don't do anything like that for economic warfare. And in fact, responsibility for economic warfare is scattered between the Treasury Department, the State Department, the Commerce Department, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And I think we really hamstring ourselves. And I think that may have been okay if you go back 20 years when we're deploying these weapons against Iran. But right now we're living in an age of economic warfare in which sanctions, tariffs, and export controls are the principal way that great powers compete. It's not just us, it's China, it's Russia, it's all the other big countries. And so I think if we keep sort of going with this shoot from the hip approach, we're going to fall behind.
Yeah. One other scenario that you lay out in your book, and I think effectively show where we're doing things right and also where we may be doing things wrong, is China. And take us through the history of the last 20 years in terms of economic warfare with China. And just as an additional piece of context on that, what's striking about the book is finally understanding that we're always at war. We are in constant warfare in two domains. One is economic warfare, and the other is digital warfare. And we always think that these events that happen are coming out of the blue, but generally it's when the background war starts going awry.
Yeah. So China is an interesting case, right? Because U.S. policy toward China really from the 1980s through the first Trump administration is really just to integrate China more intensively into the global economy, to integrate our supply chains with China, to integrate our financial markets with China. In fact, Hank Paulson, who's a big character in my book because he's the Treasury Secretary during the Stuart Levy era, he basically makes his whole career as CEO of Goldman Sachs doing business in China. And many top American business leaders of that era did. What Trump does is he basically comes in with an explicit goal of decoupling our economies to a certain extent with China. It's not something that Trump is consistent about. Sometimes he is actually more in favor of a trade deal with China. He vacillates. So I think sometimes right now when people are confused about, on the one hand, Trump is doing tariffs on China. On the other hand, he's giving TikTok a reprieve. I think that's par for the course with him. He's sort of two minds. Mm-hmm. But the story I tell in Choke Points is, there's this battle playing out between his advisors, where you have people like Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, and Matt Pottinger, the Senior Director for Asia at the NSC, on the one hand, who are very tough on China, and then people like Stephen Mnuchin at Treasury, who is of the sort of Hank Paulson school of integration. And Trump sort of goes back and forth throughout his presidency. The thing that's fascinating, though, is he comes in thinking it's really going to be about tariffs. But then, almost by accident, Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, the first thing he does as Commerce Secretary is he signs this legal settlement with a Chinese telecom company called ZTE, the second largest telecom company in China, that they then violate. We wind up imposing export controls on ZTE in April of 2018. And within weeks, China's second largest telecom company is about to go out of business. And this is sort of another aha moment, similar to the one Stuart Levy has in Bahrain. Right. Where the Trump administration realizes that the semiconductor supply chain, because ZTE is reliant on semiconductors that are made from Qualcomm and other US companies, could be used as a choke point just like the US dollar. And Xi Jinping basically winds up having to call Donald Trump in May of 2018 and beg him on the phone for a reprieve from ZTE. And he winds up giving it to them, taking the export controls off, and ZTE survives. But this sort of winds up giving a blueprint then for the export controls that are imposed on Huawei, first in 2019 and then expanded significantly in 2020. And then during the Biden administration, those export controls on Huawei are expanded to the entire Chinese economy. And that's how we got to the world where we have today, where we've basically told China that they can't have access to things like NVIDIA A100s or the most advanced semiconductors made by companies here in Silicon Valley.
So now we're in a trade war with China of a different sort, the president's favorite tool. And in some ways it seems like his only tool has been tariffs. One of the things I'm trying to understand is how does this play out when you're also going after your alternative manufacturers and your alternative suppliers? Because in general, if you're going to do a tariff war against a major power like China, you know they're going to apply tariffs back on you, and that means that you've got to have some alternative source. How do you see this playing out when, at the same time that we're doing this, we are creating animosity and trade wars and challenges with Mexico and Canada?
Sure. I'll take those as sort of two separate questions because I think they're both really important. So right now, we're hearing a lot of stuff in the news about a trade war with China. And in fact, I think one of the reasons Trump likes the idea of imposing tariffs on China is because we have a massive trade deficit, right? So we're importing from China something like $500 billion worth of goods every year, and we only export about 150 billion, right? So if you think about tariffs, which are a tax on imports, there's a lot more imports from China that we can tariff than they can tariff from us, right? Just 500 billion versus 150 billion. And so that's why Trump has this comment during his first term where he says trade wars are good and easy to win because we're running such deficits, right? The thing is, during Trump's first term, China was very unprepared for a trade war. Now, in the last 7 years, they've built a full suite of economic weapons similar to America's own. So China is not just retaliating with tariffs. They're retaliating with things like sanctions, with export controls, with economic weapons that are much stronger than tariffs. Because remember, tariffs are a tax on imports. They're not a full block of your ability to do business. And so what you've seen China do just in the last month is impose sanctions on US companies like PVH, the apparel company, on Illumina, which some of you probably know, the DNA sequencer, and a few months ago on Skydio, the biggest US drone company, that was forced to ration batteries and only provide one battery per drone. So, I mean, these are the types of retaliation that we can expect, right? And we also have seen even other asymmetric retaliation, like opening up antitrust investigations into Alphabet and NVIDIA, right? Which I think are retaliation for tariffs.
And they're clever in terms of where they apply tariffs politically, because, for example, they're going after farmers in states that President Trump needs support. So
exactly, it's very clever, and the Canadians are going to do the same thing the Mexicans do, should they ever get to that. But the other thing that the Chinese are doing that I think is very important, because this goes to the theme of choke points. Mm-hmm. There are choke points that China controls too, and in fact, in the clean energy economy, China is the dominant player. And it's not just the finished batteries that Skydio was cut off from a few months ago. It's the critical minerals that are going into those batteries. And so there's a lot of damage that China can do to the US by responding asymmetrically. By the way, I think the same is true of Canada. I think people don't think about this, but Trump's like, oh, well, Canada's tiny. If we just impose a bunch of tariffs on them, they're going to suffer and it'll be really bad. Well, you hear Doug Ford of Ontario say, well, maybe we're going to stop selling electricity to you. Or maybe Canada would just say, we're going to sell 500 to 1 million barrels of oil less to the United States. I mean, that would cripple refineries in the US and drive oil prices through the roof. So, I mean, in a true sense, what we're at risk of right now is not a tariff war or a trade war. It is a multi-domain economic war. And I'm worried that Trump could be sleepwalking into that right now.
Yeah, and do you think maybe that's the reason for the hesitancy and the stopping and starting going back and forth?
The Canada and Mexico tariffs do not make sense. And I'm happy just to be very blunt about that. I mean, as you said, Jeff, we have 3 trading partners that are by far our 3 largest trading partners: China, Canada, and Mexico. If you're going to impose tariffs on all of them, I mean, you're going to cause inflation, and critically with the Canadians and Mexicans, because of a trade deal that Trump himself, through Robert Lighthizer, negotiated, the USMCA, we now have such integrated supply chains for things like the auto sector, where you have Ford and GM saying that they're going to have to add thousands of dollars to their production costs if you have these tariffs. And so I think if you were to have 25% tariffs in place, truly, on Canada and Mexico for any prolonged period, it would cripple very important sectors of the US economy for no good reason. So that's why I do not anticipate that these tariffs actually are going to be long for this world.
Yeah. So that's one of the critical things that I think this experience is showing, that your book really helps develop and highlight, and that I think a lot of people have missed up until now, which is that we develop these phenomenal tools But once you develop a tool, everyone else figures out, I need that tool too. And they also identify their own choke points and how they can apply pressure back to us. So the third challenge that you have, besides they figured out what you're doing, they're going to do it back to you, and they've got their own choke points, is they may be able to identify places where we currently have a choke point that they could help loosen up. So for example, what would happen if the U.S. Lost its position as the reserve currency? Or what would happen if we lost our position as the leader in information technologies?
Yeah. So look, I'm glad you asked this, because this is a perfect audience to talk to you about this. Because sometimes I've been on Bloomberg the other day with people in New York, and I said, I'm convinced that in the next 5 to 10 years, the way that we do international payments is going to be totally disrupted. And they're like, what, really? I think probably here people accept that, right? I mean, there's billions of dollars. We're going into things like stablecoin-based payments. China, 4 years ago, launched a central bank digital currency largely for the purpose of evading the dollar-based financial system. You have a program called mBridge that China pioneered with Saudi Arabia and the Bank of International Settlements, in which individual central banks are using their own digital currencies to settle payments. And I don't know about you, Jeff, but the last time I made an international wire transfer, I think to buy a dresser for our newborn daughter, it took about a week to clear. Yes. I mean, you're using technology from the 1970s.
Yeah, it's like sending a telegram.
Yeah, exactly, right? I mean, you might as well put a pigeon, right, to send a check or something across the Atlantic. It's not a good system, and so it will be disrupted. The only question is, who is going to be doing the disruption? Is it going to be China or China-based consortiums like mBridge, or is it going to be the United States? Trump, I think, has almost categorically ruled out the idea of a digital dollar, a central bank digital currency, which I think is a mistake. But even if you don't have a digital dollar that's backed by the Fed, having the key sort of rails for international payments be based in the U.S., be led by U.S. companies, be subject to U.S. jurisdiction is absolutely critical from a national security standpoint. And so I think that, as we all know here in Silicon Valley, like if you are standing still, you're going to lose the race. Yeah. So I think that there's this tendency, I think, to think that choke points are immutable, and once you sort of have them, you have them. But no, they come and go. And just because we control the most powerful choke points now doesn't mean that we will tomorrow.
So, probably an unfair question, but put yourself into this administration. And there are reasons for us to want to use economic warfare against China. They are a strategic competitor. They have been very aggressive. They are challenging our primacy in areas that are critical to our, our long-term economic viability and security. And right now, their economy is a little slow and sluggish. So this would be a good time to strike. Mm-hmm. Would you be going with tariffs, putting aside what we're doing in Canada and Mexico, or what other tools do you think might be more effective?
I personally think that from a strategic competition standpoint, the thing that matters vis-a-vis China isn't so much the trade deficit in goods, right? Which I think is what Trump really cares about. He almost views it as a scoreboard. It's really about the technology race. It's who has the most advanced technology. I think the Biden administration did very good work in terms of building on the export controls on things like semiconductors that Trump really pioneered during his first term against ZTE and Huawei. But there's still obviously a lot more work to be done. We all, just a few weeks ago, were shocked when DeepSeek came out with its model that seemed to be almost as good as the ones created by OpenAI and Anthropic, using chips that were significantly less advanced than the ones that we use. But they're still using NVIDIA chips, right? They're using the NVIDIA chips that NVIDIA purpose-built to comply with export controls to go to China. I think that it's well past time that we get rid of this sort of leaky sieve export control regime and really clamp down. And I think you've even heard the executives from American AI companies like Dario Amodei say that we need to tighten the export controls. I think sometimes, and this is a general point about economic warfare, sometimes people say, well, wait, doesn't DeepSeek prove that export controls don't work? Well, I guess you have to play the counterfactual, right? I mean, how good would DeepSeek's model be if they had limitless access to the best-in-class NVIDIA chips? And people say, I think the same thing with Russia. They say, well, the sanctions on Russia haven't worked. They're still fighting a war. Well, how well would Putin be fighting that war if he had access to all the technologies that he would want to buy from the US and Europe, if he had unfettered access to the US financial system? I mean, they would be doing a lot better, right? So like any other tool of statecraft, like military force, right, where you don't win a war overnight. Last I checked, we were in Afghanistan for 20 years and we didn't quite win that one. Economic wars are not very easy to win and they can take a long time, but that doesn't mean they're not worth it.
Yeah. One of the interesting things that comes out of your book is the recognition that so much of our defense, so much of our economic and security and statecraft is in the hands of the private sector. And increasingly, it's the private sector which is driving decision-making. What are they willing to do and what are they not willing to do? And because of the strength of their lobby in DC, it can fundamentally change our ability as a nation to protect ourselves and secure our prosperity. So you've been thinking about this harder than anyone. Where do you see some of the greatest vulnerabilities or risk for us?
Yeah, so look.
Because of that, because it's not in the hands of the government, it's really in the hands of private actors.
To me, this is probably the biggest misconception about tools like sanctions and any other tool of economic warfare. You know, you often hear, you're reading the New York Times and, the U.S. froze Russian assets, right? The U.S. government froze the assets of, Putin or Sberbank or something, right? The U.S. government doesn't freeze assets, right? They tell banks that it's illegal for them to transfer the assets, and it's the actual bank that freezes the assets, right? Yeah. And so banks are really the ones who are on the front lines of financial warfare, right? What Stuart Levy pioneered was he changed the risk calculus of the banks by threatening them with being cut off from the U.S. financial system. In subsequent years, the Department of Justice also played a big role. You had banks like BNP Paribas, the major French bank, fined $9 billion for sanctions violations in 2014, which wiped out their entire net income for the year. You had HSBC fined $2 billion, right? So in this period, really, in the aughts and the 2010s, banks successfully are conscripted to be frontline infantry in America's economic wars. And today, if anything, the US government has more of trouble telling banks that they should be doing business in high-risk jurisdictions than stopping them, right? So the banks are like locked and loaded for this stuff. But then you look at other sectors, and this was actually, I think, one of my early insights I myself had working on the Russia sanctions in 2014. In the summer of 2014, we imposed export controls on technologies that companies needed to extract oil from Arctic, offshore, deepwater, and shale reserves in Russia. So the frontier oil projects in Russia. And really the purpose of this was to get companies like ExxonMobil to quit Russia, to leave Russia. Yeah. And Rex Tillerson, by the way, is the CEO of ExxonMobil at the time. The US puts these export controls in place, and Exxon continues drilling in the Arctic. And everyone's shocked. They're like, but wait, I thought everyone's so scared of us, right? And I told them, I said, no. For Rex Tillerson, there's more risk if you run from a jurisdiction like Russia at the first sight of danger than if you stay. Because, in certain businesses, you got to do business in tough places in order to be successful. Mm-hmm. And so I think with the oil sector, it's harder. And what we're finding right now is, I think it's the hardest of all with the semiconductor industry and the technology industry. Because, especially with semiconductors, on the one hand, the US government has allocated $50+ billion to try to subsidize the semiconductor companies to start building fabs in the United States. If on the other hand, we were going to them and saying, well, actually, you are doing business with China, and so we're going to fine you $5 billion, it just doesn't there's something that doesn't add up. And so I think that, unfortunately, if we are going to make the export controls on China more effective on the semiconductor space, there's going to have to be some heads on spikes. And they're going to have to be some of these companies that have been violating the export controls knowingly are going to have to be fined a significant amount of money such that the whole industry is shocked into hiring a ton of people to actually comply with these things.
Yeah. No, what comes across in the book is this notion that these are critical tools, and they're in the hands of our own people who don't control. And we have sort of a laissez-faire attitude of, they'll do the right thing for their country when it really counts. But otherwise, they're just going to pursue, profits and what private sector businesses do. And we're really leaving it in their hands in a way that we would never do with respect to being prepared in a traditional battle space where we're using kinetic tools.
Yeah, and look, I think you have to empathize with these folks, right? I mean, I don't in any way begrudge, companies like Micron for wanting to sell into the Chinese market. It's a giant market. And up until very recently, it was the explicit policy of the US government to more thoroughly integrate our economies with China, right? So in some ways, it's like whiplash for these companies, right? They thought they were doing the right thing by investing in China. So I do think you got to be empathetic, and you have to understand also that they have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize shareholder value. And so I think it's incumbent upon the United States government to give very clear instructions to these companies. And even if you're not ready to roll out the next export control or the next sanction, to at least outline your strategy so that they can make long-term investments and have some sense of whether or not this investment is going to pay off.
Yeah. So I did some finger pointing at the private sector, but in the public sector side, you have a great vignette where you talk about how you go into rooms where you're talking about economic warfare, and if you're talking about traditional warfare of military weapons, everyone's leaning forward. They all got an opinion. They've been studying this. They really care about it. You started talking about economic warfare tools, and we were like, the blocking sanctions of the federal direct. What do you just call product rule? Is that it? People kind of glaze over, they tune out, but I think of it like the early days of Silicon Valley, where they said, well, I'm okay just sending things with a stamp, but I guess this email thing is okay. I don't know why they took away my typewriter. This big box is taking up a lot of space. And that people didn't really see where, the bigger picture. And I think we have some of that in government.
I agree. And look, the reason I wrote this book was based on my own experience in government, where I would sit in meetings in the Situation Room, and we'd be debating really important questions, like, are we going to impose sanctions on the biggest bank in Russia? And basically the way it would work would be there would be one or two people at the table who would know anything or even feel confident enough to weigh in, and everyone else would just sort of nod along. And so it was almost like the oracle at Delphi. You'd wait for the person to give the pronouncement. Oh, well, this is okay from a liquidity standpoint. And okay, sure, yes, sir. And then when you get up to even higher levels, because sometimes I would get to go, with Kerry or with Tony Blinken, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, and sit in, at deputies committees and principals committees meeting. They have no clue about any of these tools, right? And it's because up until very recently, the U.S. foreign policy community wasn't expected to understand anything about economics or economic warfare. The reason I started teaching my class at Columbia was in hopes of training the next generation so that they can do this stuff much more professionally. Mm-hmm. But I thought the way to scale that, to actually enable not just people who want to work in public service, but people in tech companies and banks, everyday citizens, to participate in this debate, I had to sort of put together a book that would make this accessible.
Yeah. Well, you succeeded. And New York Times just validated that today. So before we get to some of the questions from the audience, and you've generated quite a few questions, I think one more kind of meta insight that comes out of your book is one which was, there's sort of prophecies of this by like Alan Greenspan and Walter Wriston and many people in Silicon Valley. And kind of the Ned Beatty character in Network, where he's like, there is no Russia and China and America and, Germany. There is, today it would be, Google and Facebook and NVIDIA and, and that really we're moving in a direction where the major tools of war will be whoever controls the finance systems, whoever controls the information systems, whoever controls these choke points, the currencies, and if you control those, then you truly are in charge. And that we are in a transition period of where we're moving from nation states being the dominant force for governance in our world to corporations, with the state's still playing a role, but more of a subordinate role.
Look, I think that clearly the biggest advantage that the United States has internationally is the dynamism of our economy. It is our ability to produce world-changing technologies. It's our ability to pioneer life-saving medications and drugs. So this is all happening in the private sector, right?
Yeah.
However, and this is a big sort of caveat I would put there. Economic warfare is only possible with state capacity. Because if you just have companies that are sort of acting of their own volition, maximizing shareholder value left and right, you're not going to get the outcomes you want. You may wind up becoming even more dependent on China. You might wind up becoming even more dependent on Russia, for instance, right? So I think it's very important for the government to play a significant role in sort of guiding these companies in ways that protect our national security in the United States, especially, as you said earlier, China and other countries have caught up, right? These tools are not just tools that the US possesses. We are vulnerable, and we're increasingly vulnerable. And one of the things that worries me in particular about the current administration is you see Trump basically trying to use economic warfare as a cure-all, right? For any possible issue, whether it's fentanyl, whether it's Colombia not accepting migrants, whether it's the China trade deficit, everything, is recipe for using tariffs and sanctions. But on the other hand, he's gutting the federal government and firing all of the young, smart people who actually do this stuff. And so I worry that he's simultaneously giving us a much bigger mission statement while at the same time killing our human capital.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting point about the probationary workers. Probationary workers, it's not they're on probation because they did something wrong or they're not good. It's because they're new. Most people who are making decisions in D.C., unfortunately, are not digital natives, and they are still trying to figure out, whether Facebook is a book. As a result, you have the people who are most likely to be nimble and capable of advancing our advantages and identifying our vulnerabilities are the people that we're not allowing to come into government.
That's right. I think if let's say even if you were wanting to do a reduction in force, which I don't think is certainly not warranted in the national security agencies. If you want to do a reduction in force, the last thing you would do would be to hire the fire the probationary workers. So these are people who had just graduated from Stanford or from Columbia, who've been working in the federal government for a year or two, who are in their 20s or late 20s, early 30s, maybe don't have kids. They're willing to work 16-hour days, and they understand technology. So it doesn't make sense to me.
Well, this may play into one of the first questions, which is, you've honed in on the role of technology in geopolitical relationships. What do you see, besides the fact that we're not allowing enough technologists to get into government, as the biggest threat to that sector today?
Biggest threat to the technology sector?
Yeah, to the technology sector and to our security as a result.
Look, I do think that our dependence on China for certain important technologies, like battery technologies, like critical minerals, is a serious vulnerability. And if you think about it, we are moving, I think, to a world in which technological innovation isn't just happening in bits, but also in bytes, right? And also in the macro world, right? It's disrupting the physical economy around us. I think that's why you're starting to see more hard tech investments in places like Silicon Valley. But most of these hard tech investments are relying on batteries, on inputs that are made in China. I think Biden was trying, sort of making baby steps to rectify this through things like the Inflation Reduction Act and by imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. What you've heard Trump say is that we don't want to do the Inflation Reduction Act. We don't even want to do the CHIPS Act, right? I mean, he denigrated the CHIPS Act in his State of the Union speech the other day.
Yes.
And he seems to think that industrial policy has no place and that he can get investment in key sectors of the U.S. economy just through tariffs. Personally, I just don't see, I don't believe that would happen. So I'm worried that this sort of move that we've had toward a carefully calibrated strategic investment in key sectors of our economy to lessen our dependence on China and to foster dynamism at home is really at risk of being on the chopping block during the Trump administration for no other reason than it was put forward during the Biden administration.
what we're thinking in terms of the existing technologies today, chips, AI, but there are other major technologies on the horizon. There's a big movement towards a mass expansion of cryptocurrency and using blockchain technologies. There is a war going on over who's going to be the first to unlock the key to quantum and quantum computing. And then there are, in addition to biotech technology races, there's energy races, including trying to develop nuclear fusion. In very serious ways at very advanced levels, and that is moving rapidly. All these major technological advances that could give one country a massive advantage over all other countries. When you think about that wave of new technologies that are coming at us, what keeps you awake at night? And no, I'll stop there. I got a second question.
Yeah, sure. So the obvious answer is artificial intelligence. I think that we are right to want to have the most frontier AI developed here in the United States. I think we're also right. I think this was what Biden tried to do at the very end of his administration through this AI diffusion rule, to really try not only to be careful about having American companies at the forefront of artificial intelligence, but also even to ensure that our allied countries weren't, letting China basically train their models on American chips that are in, Singapore or in some other country, which is basically something that has been a concern, right? Because you can use cloud computing, for instance, to train artificial intelligence models. The one that keeps me up at night, though, and this really comes back to the question of just where we're most vulnerable, really is in this sort of clean energy economy. Because this is the one area where we are very, very, very far behind. And I don't think it's not worth sugarcoating it, because, Biden imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, the reason you do that is if you had fair competition, China makes better electric vehicles than U.S. companies at a half the cost, And so they would flood the U.S. market, and before you know it, we'd all be driving around in Chinese EVs. And so I think, as somebody who believes that we do need a clean energy transition, and does believe that climate change is a significant threat to humanity, I worry about the fact that we are 100% reliant, basically, on our chief adversary for all of the core technologies and inputs that go into clean energy.
It seems like you had a lot of aha moments as you were writing. Sometimes, as you're digesting the experience that you've had and doing studies, you start seeing connections. Were there any things as you were writing that really surprised or shocked you?
Yes. Yeah, I appreciate this one. So I explicitly decided to write Choke Points as a narrative history with characters, right? With human beings, people like Stuart Levy, people like Robert Lighthizer. And that's really from my own experience being in government, where I see that entrepreneurs, policy entrepreneurs, make a big difference, right? And it's actually human beings who are the ones who are driving these innovations. At the same time, after I finished writing the books, I read at the very, very end, I was sort of looking back across this whole narrative, across decades of American economic warfare, and I realized something, which was that if you look at Barack Obama, he imposes sanctions at twice the rate of George W. Bush. And then you have Donald Trump impose sanctions at twice the rate of Barack Obama. And then you have Joe Biden impose sanctions at twice the rate of Donald Trump. And so you got to start thinking to yourself, well, there's a pattern here. This is exponential growth. And it can't just be individuals, right? There has to be something structural. And so the aha moment I had as I was really trying to figure out how to wrap things up in my book was, what is this structural driver of the age of economic warfare? And what I came up with is this idea of the geo-economic impossible trinity, in which economic interdependence, economic security, and geopolitical competition, only two of those can exist at one time. And if you look at the Cold War, obviously there's geopolitical competition between the US and the Soviet Union, but there's no economic interdependence. We're basically not trading at all with the Soviet Union. And so we still have a sense of economic security. After the Cold War ends, we start looking at China and Russia more as friends than adversaries. And so we can embrace economic interdependence because we no longer have geopolitical competition, and we still have our sense of economic security. But what's happened now is that economic interdependence persists, But geopolitical competition has come back with a vengeance.
Right.
And so we've lost our sense of economic security. And this is true in the United States, it's true in China, it's true in the European Union, it's true in Japan, it's true in Russia. None of the big countries now feel like they have economic security. And so one way of viewing these things like tariffs and sanctions and export controls, it's a scramble for these countries to regain their sense of security and basically building a new economic order brick by brick with every single sanction, with every single new tariff that's imposed.
I took us out into the future relatively quickly. And there were certain things that are lessons learned moments in your book that some of the audience members would like to go back to.
Sure.
You had described the attacks of 9/11 as being a pivotal moment in U.S. economic and foreign policy. Can you expand on how this shift in policy and shifted our policy and led to the adoption of weaponized finance?
Sure. So I think there are two very important things that come out on 9/11. One is there's a raft of new laws that basically give the U.S. government more authority to crack down on illicit finance. The Patriot Act, which some people might remember, contains a provision that allows the U.S. government to designate any country or any company in a foreign country a jurisdiction of primary money laundering concern. And the idea was that the Al-Qaeda plotters that took down the World Trade Center, they had used bank accounts in their own names in the U.S. financial system. And they basically, had free reign in the U.S. financial system. And so the idea was that this should never happen again. The thing was, like, these tools were developed for relatively small time issues, right? I mean, the 9/11 attacks cost $500,000 to prosecute. So in some ways, they wind up being a proof of concept for the much more aggressive financial warfare campaigns against Iran, Russia, and China. I think the second reason that 9/11 is important in this story is that 9/11, of course, winds up precipitating the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And from a political standpoint, those two wars, very quickly, after just a few years, are seen to become quagmires. And military force, which was something that in the 90s, the U.S. deployed quite a bit. We had tons of different sort of limited military interventions in places like the Balkans, in parts of Africa, in parts of Latin America. After Iraq and Afghanistan, the American people lose their love for military force on both sides of the aisle. And so in some ways, necessity is the mother of invention. Economic warfare rises to prominence as the next best alternative.
Yep. And you see, traditional warfare also shifting in Ukraine. Once people run out of these tools and they've fired all their missiles, they start figuring out how to adapt drones and can actually accomplish many of the same things with the same lethality at a much lower cost,
right?
And with greater precision. So necessity becomes a mother of invention.
I agree.
When you think about your book, like you never quite finish a book. You just run out of time and patience of your publisher. So what do you think about that you wish you could have added or expanded upon now that the book is out there?
Sure. Well, I hate to spoil the ending of my book for people who haven't read it yet, but unfortunately,
buy the book.
Yeah.
Let me just say,
yeah. Unfortunately, I end the book in a bit of an ominous or somber way, and I think that unfortunately the events of the last several months since I finished the book have, if anything, made me a little bit more pessimistic, and I think it's because just to go back to this idea of the impossible trinity, we need to figure out a way to regain our sense of economic security. And I really think there are two possible directions we could go as a global economy. I think the one direction that I was hoping we would be moving in was one where we reduce our interdependence with our adversaries, with China, with Russia, but simultaneously become closer with other democracies, that we integrate even more tightly with Canada, with Mexico, with the European Union, with Australia, with Japan, This was the concept of friendshoring that Janet Yellen coined during the Biden administration. And actually, interestingly enough, it's a similar concept to what Trump's first-term U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer argued in a recent New York Times op-ed, which is that we should have a block of democracies with very low tariffs and then high tariffs on everybody else, like China and Russia. The thing I'm worried about, Jeff, is that what I've seen so far from the Trump administration is that every country is potentially in the firing line, not just the Chinas and Russias in the world, but even potentially to a greater extent, Canada, Mexico, the European Union, Colombia. And I think what kind of world that augurs is one where every nation is for itself, and the only potential long-term investment that makes any sense is domestically in the United States. And I think what that does is it will be bad for inflation, it'll be bad for economic growth here, it'll be bad for innovation, so it won't be good economically. But as somebody who really comes at this primarily from a geopolitical perspective, the thing that really worries me is what history shows is that when states can't acquire markets and resources through open trade, they're tempted to conquer foreign lands. They're tempted to seize foreign resources.
That is what colonialism is.
Yeah, exactly. I think when you hear Trump talking about seizing Greenland for their mineral resources, there are frightening echoes that I hear of the justification that Hitler had for Lebensraum, seizing parts of the former Soviet Union for its material resources. And I think that was driven by a similar chaotic breakdown in the global economy that happens after the Great Depression, happens after the imposition of the Hawley-Smoot Tariff in 1930. And so I think there are really, really frightening echoes. So I think if I were to write the book now, my short answer, which I actually do have to write, a preface to the Japanese edition. So I will be at least those of us, if anyone's listening in Japan, you will get this soon. Yeah. I'll dive into that a little more about just unpacking some of the implications of what a autarchical economic model leads to.
Yeah, no, I've been doing some writing about what Machiavelli would advise someone who wanted to have more of an autocratic republic in today. And one of the thoughts was, and this is about 4 months ago, trying to annex Canada, try to annex Greenland because of the effects of climate change, or creating passages up there where it's much easier to access valuable oils, both energy resources and critical minerals. I didn't publish it because I thought it was just too crazy, and people would think I was nuts. But that's where we are now. That's where we are. So this is a question from the audience. Let's be optimistic. What is something you've seen or expect to see from the Trump administration's wielding of economic power that you think is cause for optimism?
Oof.
You have 8 minutes.
Oh, man. Cause for optimism. Look, what I will say is I do know many of the folks in the current Trump administration. Not all of them, but many of them. And I will say that there are a good handful of them that are patriotic, that are smart, and that view these issues probably very similarly to the way I did. What you'll see if you flip to the note on the sources at the very end of Choke Points is I interviewed well over 100 people for the book, including all of the top Trump 1 administration officials, including some middle-level officials who now are the top administration officials this time around. And I think if there's one thing that I'm maybe a little optimistic about, is I do think that on China, we may wind up in an okay place. And that's because Trump, again, I think will vacillate, but I think Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio are pretty tough on China. And the people around them are not only tough on China, but also smart on China. And so I think some of the types of export controls on semiconductors that Biden, frankly, wasn't willing to do, I think there's a good chance you start seeing them come down the pike in the Trump administration.
So to some extent, the hesitancy could be seen as learning, sort of on-the-job learning, and seeing how the financial markets react, see how allies respond, understanding, that some of the risks that were articulated weren't just, people who were scared to act, but, were people who identified real threats that could have long-term damage. And perhaps that will start to settle down the decision making on these.
Can I make one other comment too?
Sure.
Because now I'm realizing there's one other thing that I think is worth putting out there, because it's something that I'm conflicted about, because I've spent a lot of my career working on Russia and Ukraine, and I think that the policy that I've seen so far on Russia makes no sense. And basically, we're getting taken for a ride by Putin, and that Putin's trying to sell us a whole sell us something that doesn't exist, right? At the same time, if you look at what Trump's doing, you now see the incoming German chancellor saying that they're going to spend $500 billion on Germany's defense industry. You're starting to see, the British and the French saying that they're willing to put boots on the ground to maintain peace in Ukraine. So I think that to a certain extent, lighting a fire under the Europeans has not been a bad thing. Yeah. But I think when you couple that with surrendering to Putin, you have a very bad policy. So I think if Trump could pull back from the brink on Russia, but maybe nudge the Europeans a little more, we wouldn't be in such a bad place.
Well, both of those things are not quite America first. Again, Machiavelli says, you never want to strengthen the lesser powers, and Russia is a lesser power right now. And with respect to the European Union, they're a lesser power as well, and they will benefit from this. I think they have gotten a little flabby economically and in terms of overregulating themselves, and they will become much more nimble and much more of a competitor by virtue of these changes. That doesn't help the United States. It's actually been helpful to the United States that there's been such great dependence by the EU.
Yeah, I have a slightly different take, which is that I think that I'm more comfortable with the EU having an independent military, for instance, than previous Democratic and Republican administrations have been. And I think my own view, just having dealt with these people, and it could be too personal, based on personal experiences, I do think there's a cultural element to international relations. I think there's a reason why the U.S. has such close relationships with the U.K. and with New Zealand and with Australia and with France and with Germany. And I think that I'm personally comfortable with the idea of the EU playing a bigger role and also playing a more autonomous role.
Yeah. We're down to the last question. So, what gives you hope? I think one of the things that gives me hope is, after listening to people talk about these lazy dummies who are sitting in government, listening to you for an hour reminds me of just the extraordinary intelligence, energy, commitment of people who serve in federal government, who are really trying to solve critical problems that the public isn't even aware of, and would never anticipate if there weren't people like you doing it. What gives you hope?
Yeah. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Jeff. And this goes back to something I said earlier about my decision to write Choke Points as a character-driven narrative history, which is that the real strength that we have as a country is our people. The fact that we have the most innovative people, we have some of the most creative people, hardworking people in the United States. And I'm hoping that including more folks from Silicon Valley in Washington, which we're starting to see, will open up the aperture to even more people going into public service. So if we can get through some of the rough waters, I think, that are ahead, if the ultimate consequence of this current administration is that more people on this side of the country, as opposed to just those of us in New York and Washington, are going to take the call of public service seriously, I think we'll be even better off as a country.
Yeah. Edward, one of the big challenges for America has been the divide between California and D.C. for too long. And we have not had enough of our best and brightest investing in public service, and likewise, we don't have enough of our public servants really understanding the enormous force of the technological changes that are going on out here. You've done a beautiful job, I think, of demonstrating what we can do when we harmonize these and we work together. So I'd like to ask everyone in the audience to give a special thanks to Edward Fishman, the New York Times best-selling author of Choke Points, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, and we encourage you to pick up a copy of Edward's new book here or at the local bookstore. And please support the Commonwealth Club World Affairs efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible by becoming a member. For more information, visit www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Jeff Bleish. Thank you, and see you the next time.